Welcome back to Healing Mindset. I am Nazish, and tonight we're stepping into a conversation that dares to challenge what many people have been taught to believe about mental illness. We are looking at bipolar disorder, not through fear or stigma, but through the lens of consciousness, transformation, and healing. Joining me is amazing Sean Blackwell, author, holotropic breathwork facilitator, and a visionary behind Bipolar Awakening. For almost 2 decades, Sean has been helping people understand bipolar disorder not as a life sentence, but as a profound call towards inner awakening. He invites us to see trauma, transformation through a radically compassionate perspective. Sean, welcome to Healing Mindset. I'm so glad you are here. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good, Nazish. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So, let's start with the heart of your work. Your book reframes bipolar disorder as potential awakening process. That's such a revolutionary perspective. What first led you to see bipolar disorder not just as a diagnosis, but as something deeply transformative?
Okay, well, it's a quite a long story, but I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. In 1996, I was a frustrated advertising executive, and I took a intensive self-help course on a weekend, a course called the Landmark Forum. And on that course, they asked us to do a short 5-minute meditation on our fears. I didn't think I felt any fear. I was 30 at the time. And in the middle of that meditation, about 2 minutes in, I had a vision of a depth gauge from my scuba diving equipment that I had seen 2 months earlier because I had a very serious accident scuba diving. I lost my weight belt 30 meters below sea level and went shooting to the surface. And in that moment of coming up to the surface, I was watching my depth gauge, wondering if I was going to even see the surface, because you can die in that situation. You can have an air embolism in your brain and die instantly. And so, but I didn't feel any fear in that moment. I was too concerned with just relaxing and trying to stay alive. But during this meditation in the course, I saw my depth gauge, and then I just burst into tears, and there was a punch at my heart, and all this energy came out of my heart, and I was weeping, and I was feeling a lot of fear. And when it was over, all of my senses had sharpened. I could see detail in curtains that I could never see before. Sense of smell was stronger, this kind of thing. So that was the beginning of this intensive self-help course. And those kind of feelings would continue for the next 4 days. I was at night, I was up writing things about my life. I was talking to my family about family issues. I just broke wide open. And by the 5th day of the course, I'd come to the conclusion that you could only have this feeling that I had, this sense of like I finally knew things I never knew before, a sense of all knowingness, a sense of connectedness and aliveness that I'd never felt before, that I must have died. And I thought I must have died during the scuba diving accident, and that everything else was sort of a middle ground between reality, living alive, and being in some sort of heaven or nirvana. So I thought I was in a kind of a purgatory. And at that, once I realized that I was dead, then I went into an adjacent hotel ballroom because the course was being taking place in a ballroom. And I took off all my clothes and I went to meet God. I thought I was transforming into another reality. And so that eventually the staff found me, and then they called the police, and they handcuffed me to a stretcher and took me to the psychiatric hospital. Um, Yeah, because I just refused to put my clothes back on, and I thought everything was a dream. When I got to the hospital, I still thought I was sort of floating through space to another dimension. I still thought I was being tested by God. And, but after they gave me a forced injection and 48 hours of sleep, and when I woke up and I saw I was still in the same place, I thought to myself, well, I don't know what's going on, but I need to get out of here. And so I was lucky. I told the psychiatrist what they wanted to hear, and I went home with my parents after only 4 days. That was a very unusual situation, but it was always very spiritual for me, and I just thought the psychiatrists didn't know what they were dealing with because I had had some sort of an awakening experience. I know it was messy, I thought I died, but that was, an experience that changed my life in 1996. After I returned to work a few months later, my career got a lot better. It started with a modest raise, but then my salary tripled over the next 3 years. And, so things got a lot better in my life. And that was where I first started to question psychiatry. But at the time, at that moment, I had no idea that what I had been through would be anything related to what might be considered bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. It was a year later that I found the work of Dr. Stanislav Grof, and he had written a book called Spiritual Emergence or The Stormy Search for the Self, where he said there was this thing called a spiritual emergency that can look like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but is actually quite good for you. It's beneficial. And I had all the symptoms of what he would call a spiritual emergency. And so from there, I was like, well, this is what happened to me. I had a spiritual emergency. And in that moment, I thought, well, my experience was something maybe 1 in 20,000 people would experience. It was very unique, very special, and it was very good for me, but it was nothing like a mental illness. And that's where I stood in 1998. Okay. A lot to take in.
My God, that is such a like, thank you so much for sharing your journey and your experience with us. And I believe it would have been a really difficult moment for you. Yeah. So, your perspective actually gives so many possibilities to our listeners that shifting the narrative from pathology to profound inner meaning. It's just so amazing the way you shared about your journey and you made it like you made bipolar disorder something as meaningful instead of something shameful or hopeless.
Well, at the time in 1997, I wasn't really dealing with the public. I wasn't talking about my experience. I went back to advertising and I was quite quiet about the whole thing, because
Mhm.
so few people would understand. But in 2007, my wife had a younger niece. I was living in Brazil at the time, and her younger niece had an episode. And then I looked at that, and it was being diagnosed as bipolar, and I caught and we helped her recover quite quickly, even though she was on medications. She was on psych meds. She recovered very quickly with our support, and but they continued to keep her on the medication. And so then that was the moment, like 10 years after my experience in Brazil, that I started to investigate and say, well, what was the difference between what happened to me in 1996 and what happened to my wife's niece, Anna, in 2007? And that's when I started to make YouTube videos on a channel called Am I Bipolar or Waking Up? Because my first video was called Am I Bipolar or Waking Up? And let people decide for themselves. And I told them my story. And then I got a lot of feedback from people around the world saying, your story is very similar to my own, except I'm medicated for life. What can I do? And everything started to come back like that. And because of the research I had done back then, I realized that, wow, this thing with bipolar disorder was a lot closer to what I went through than I realized. And there were actually some pioneering psychologists in the 80s who had recognized that psychosis, like this break with reality, where you think you're dreaming, that this break with reality was actually an intended reorganization of the psyche. It was actually trying to heal you. It wasn't a illness. It was actually trying to heal you, but that it needed empathetic support. And so I went to my wife's, or I had intended to go back to my wife's niece, Anna's parents, and say, look, let's take her off the meds. And if she has another psychosis, we can support her through it in an empathetic way. And just as I was about to do that, her sister, Eliana, came back from Europe and went into psychosis. She had a break with reality. And She knew what had happened to her younger sister, and so she contacted us first. And then we were able to stay with her in an empathetic way for 5 days before we even told her parents that we had her, and worked her through her first episode. Now, that summer, she went on to have 2 more episodes. But in the third episode, we had agreed with the family that we would support her without the meds. And we were able to do that. And when she was finished, instead of being in the psychiatric hospital, instead of being medicated for life, she was able to return to university free of medications, finish with honors, came out and got a very good job. So it was a really big success. It was a very validating experience that came after a lot of research and a lot of understanding of the deeper nature of the disorder and the traumatic roots. And that's where I started to work with people personally, first on a volunteer basis, and then later in 2013, I started a retreat process, a private retreat process for people. So that's sort of how things unfolded.
That is so beautiful, and I'm really happy that it worked out for your niece. Um, but like I have seen a lot of people, once they receive a diagnosis, it becomes the part of their whole identity. So how do you help someone reconnect with the part of themselves that exists beyond labels and clinical definition?
Well, usually I very rarely and almost never do I get the opportunity to work with people in their first break of psychosis that their parents send them to the psychiatrist. So usually when people come to me, they've seen the work I've put online, mostly through some very powerful YouTube videos that were made between 2007 and 2012, but are still going strong. I've got 25,000 subscribers there. And these people have honestly never really accepted their diagnosis. And that's a common thing, you know. So when they come to me, they haven't really accepted psychiatry. They're looking for an alternative. They're desperate to get off the medications. And they've usually been in the hospital 4 or 5 times, you know. So it's harder to work with them by the time they get to me than it would have been if they'd come to me the first time. But so in answer to your question, the people who come to me have naturally not accepted the diagnosis. If people have accepted the diagnosis, they don't look for me. They don't call me. Understand?
Yes, I definitely understand that. And your perspective sounds so grounding and helpful to a lot of people who are finding a way to accept their diagnosis and a lot of things after that. So when that shift happens, when someone moves from what's wrong with me to what is waking up in me, what is the earliest change you begin to see in them?
Well, the first thing is like on the retreats, there's a big part of this waking up process that has to deal with dealing with your trauma. And what is trauma? Well, trauma is a part of life experiences that you have not allowed yourself to feel because they're too painful. So, being physically or sexually abused can be among the most serious. But also, emotional repression can be part of it too. Sometimes people are not allowed to be very emotional within their own family dynamic. Although I don't think in India that's as much of a problem. But in Europe, it definitely is. And in Canada, it definitely is where I'm from. And so the first key is if people are going to heal their disorder, and we sort of change the language a little bit as we go, but when the first steps are working towards healing your trauma. And if you can work on that, that healing is part of your personal development. And that personal development is part of your awakening to a certain degree. Yeah. That's and so it all becomes the same thing. Awakening, personal development, healing. It all is sort of looking at the same phenomenon with a slightly different lens. And then when they have healed or when they have awakened, it's not really a big mountaintop experience. It actually can feel like in the beginning, it can feel like someone's pulled the rug out from under you and you've landed on your butt and you don't know which way to go. And you need a process of integration because your ego mind hasn't caught up to who you actually are in the moment, you know. But once you're there, you are more open and relaxed and peaceful. So it's not a big mountaintop, oh, I've reached the top of the mountain, I'm enlightened experience. No, it's just you become more relaxed, open, and peaceful. And other people notice that and they become more peaceful around you. And that's where you start to be a benefit to society, not by doing anything particularly, but just being the natural expression of yourself, you know?
That shift really feels very liberating. Like you can hear the dignity come back into the person rather than the diagnosis controlling the narrative.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then eventually you can get your peace back and you can be in a peaceful surrounding around you as well.
Yep.
So, you talk about holotropic breath work, that is such an important part of your retreats. For listeners who may be totally new to it, what makes this practice so powerful for assessing the deep roots of trauma?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that holotropic breath work is very difficult for people to understand unless they've really done it, because it's not exactly a breathwork technique per se, like a pranayama or a kundalini breath of fire, where maybe you've got a certain technique of breathing where you go in through the nose and out through the mouth and hold it for 10 seconds and focus on your sixth chakra or something like that. It's not fixed like that. It's actually just an encouragement of aggressive breathing, but there's a specific environment involved. You have to be in a safe setting where you can emotionally express yourself without, and that means the capacity to be loud and scream without having neighbors knock on your door, so it needs to be a safe setting. It also needs to be a very quiet setting. So you can't do this in a noisy environment. Powerful music is played, usually strong drumming in the beginning, and then it gets more emotional. And you need a trained facilitator who knows what they're doing, because you need someone who's comfortable being present to powerful, painful emotions coming up without trying to manipulate the situation. And that takes some training, because usually when we're upset or when someone's angry, we'll say things like, it's okay, stop crying, you're going to be okay. And these techniques soothe the person, and soothing doesn't heal. What you need to do as a facilitator is be present to them, be present to their pain, be there for them, and just allow them to continue the process, keep going until it's through. And then if the person's able to work through a process, and how they work through it is with physical movement. You're on a yoga mat, so you're going to be moving. Sometimes it might even look like you're dancing, and vocalizing, strong vocal tones, screaming, talking to relatives, dead relatives who are there or may not be there, whatever is going on in your intuition. And so what the breath is doing is, imagine that you're a surfer, and before you can surf, you need to swim out to meet the waves. Well, the breathing is like the swimming. It's getting you out to meet the ocean of the waves of your unconscious. And then once those waves of unconscious material surface, then you're not so worried about the breathing. You're focused more on the expression of what's going on inside of you physically and in a vocal way as well, you know. And so that's how the trauma gets released. And it can, a few breathwork sessions can do more for you than a year of talk therapy, really.
I can actually imagine that. And the way you talk about it just makes so much sense. So I just want to know, are there emotional releases or patterns that tend to show up often for people who are working through bipolar disorders?
Sure. And we all carry, all people, regular people carry trauma, emotional tension, and we carry it in our body. And I don't think that I've emphasized that enough. And then when people have a diagnosis like bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, or depression, those groups of PTSD, of course, and a few other diagnoses, they're just carrying more trauma than they can deal with. You know, they might be a more emotionally sensitive person, or they might be just more heavily traumatized, or they've done more than their share of drugs, or a mix of all three. But they've crossed a certain threshold, which is taking them into this dream state that is acute psychosis. And so that's what's happened. This whole thing about mental disorders being genetic, being caused by too much or too little dopamine or serotonin is a pure myth. There are no medical exams that will show that you have a mental disorder of any kind. Not a single medical exam exists. And there is no medical evidence or scientific evidence that this is the case. In fact, having the science shows, the research shows that people have the same range of serotonin and dopamine in their brains when they have a disorder as regular people do. So when you go to the psychiatric hospital, they will often put you through a kind of charade of giving you the medical exams as if they're going to find something. It almost gives them like the medical credibility, but those exams never come back because there's never anything wrong with you, unless you've got dementia or something like that.
That explanation really gives such a grounded sense to how deep healing unfolds. Like it is not through pressure or anything of that sort, it is just through surrender, and which is
Yeah.
an amazing perspective to it. And I'm very sure that a lot of our listeners will be able to benefit from it because a lot of us are not aware about this.
No, this my work is pioneering work. It's pioneering work, and my book is called Bipolar Awakenings: The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder. So you can, I don't know, it's a radio show, but yeah, there it is, and it documents 18 years of working with people, and the patterns are all very familiar, and you know,
So that belief that bipolar disorder cannot be healed without lifelong medication is like deeply rooted in mainstream psychiatry. Like that is something that lot of people believe. How do you navigate that conversation respectfully while still honoring the possibility of deeper inner transformation?
yeah, and I've said a few things negative about psychiatry on this call, but the bottom line is people do need to function. You know, you need to be able to get up in the morning. You got to go to work. You got to take your kids to school. You want to keep your marriage together. So psych meds do play an important role when we don't have a society or a culture that helps people heal yet in a somatic way. You know, so when I work with people, I tell them to remain on their medications. When we do private retreats together, they stay on the medications for their entire retreat and afterwards. Then, after a few months, they notice how they feel. And if they're feeling continually with low energy or dragging, then that's a good excuse to talk to your psychiatrist about reducing the medication slowly, like a 25% reduction, for example. Because um, being uh, draggy or slow, hard to get out of bed, is a sign that you're over medicated. So that's my strategy is I don't wait for people to feel amazing because if you go to your psychiatrist and say, I feel amazing, I'm off my medication, they'll be like, well, you're going to be back here in the hospital in 6 months, so they don't care. They don't trust that. But if you go back and say, you're feeling really drowsy, sleepy, you can't get out of bed in the morning, I think I'm over medicated. Can I do a gradual withdrawal? That's a very reasonable request, you know especially when it's true. And that's the sign of healing. The sign of healing is that you're kind of heavy, on your meds. And then you can get off your meds and you'll feel better. You know.
That is so refreshing to hear that honors both safety and possibility. It's like a balance um that is in your approach. Like it's not dismissing sign, but also not limiting people's potential for healing, which is so refreshing to hear.
Yeah, I've actually got 4 parts of my work that I think are important where I consider the benefits of these parts. And these parts often inside clash with each other. And the first is I have a respect for psychiatry and the need for people to function. I have a respect for the intellectual theory of transpersonal psychology, the work of Stan Grof. So that's the intellectual side. There is a theory that needs to be followed. It's not just this sort of, well, we can just come at it any way we want. No, you've got trauma that needs to be released. If you're not doing that, you're not going to heal. You know. Um,
Yeah.
then the peer support movement is sort of an anti-psychiatry movement, but very close with people in the movement. And that brings an emotional bonding with people. And so I tell people, don't forget, I was in the psychiatric hospital too. So I'm not so different from my client. It's not a hierarchical situation of I'm the therapist and you're the patient. No, I've been in the hospital too. I can get crazy I've been able to get crazy just like anyone else, you know? And then the last part is um, the spirituality, and that the work itself has a strong shamanic aspect because the healing actually takes place by divine intelligence. We're just setting the table, but it's basically God, the Godhead, divine spirit that is doing the healing work. We're just setting things up so that that healing work can be done in a safe way. So it's spirituality, emotional, intellectual, and biological in looking at psychiatry, psychology, peer support movement, and spirituality. All those four parts play a role.
That is so intriguing. That is so enlightening for us. And I believe that it is something that people should know about and what role they play in their life.
Me too. I agree.
Yeah.
That's why lots of podcasts.
Much appreciated. Trust me, the way I am learning so much on this episode with you, I feel like the what I am learning will be something that a lot of people will also be learning, and it is going to benefit so much of us to have. If even if we have a friend or a known who has bipolar, we will be benefiting by knowing more from this podcast. I know that many of our listeners would are going to explore more of your work and will want to connect with your work, and whether it is about your book or your retreats or your videos. So please share where they can connect with you.
Sure. Well, the first place you can start is at my website, bipolarawakenings.com, bipolarawakenings.com. And both of my books, Am I Bipolar or Waking Up, and Bipolar Awakenings, are available as free PDFs. So people can download those for free.
Okay, I will make sure to include all these links and details to the show notes. And thank you so much for sharing these details with us and the amazing insight, Sean. Thank you for bringing such courage and compassion to this conversation. Tonight's discussion reminds us that mental health isn't always a story of disorder. Sometimes it is a story of awakening. And to everyone listening, if this episode nudged you to rethink what healing or transformation could look like, follow that curiosity. Healing isn't linear, but it is possible, especially when we learn to approach ourselves with gentleness and openness. Until next time, I am Nazish and this is Healing Mindset. Stay aware, stay grounded, and keep listening for the parts of you that may simply be waking up.